Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Parenting Through the Parsha with Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
We start a new book of the Torah this week. We begin the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. And as things get underway, as many of you, of course, know, our people aren't in great shape. A new pharaoh emerges, enslaves the people with a series of cruel decrees, escalate things to the point where all male babies are supposed to be thrown into the river. And you can well imagine that people at that moment are ready to throw up their hands and say, what's the point? And there's a poignant moment that is explored through Midrash, through rabbinic text, that tackles this question that we often think about as people, and for some of us, of course, is particularly present in this moment, of how do we respond when things are feeling fraught, painful, overwhelming, maybe even too difficult to go on. Amram, who we of course know will end up being Moses' father, is ready to divorce his wife. We're told by the rabbis. He's ready to divorce his wife and say, essentially, there's no point. I can't do this anymore. And we're then told that Miriam takes him to task and says, you're worse than Pharaoh. That by completely removing yourself from this relationship, by not being willing to continue to build a family, by saying, essentially, you give up. Yes, Pharaoh is through this decree sentencing roughly 50% of babies to their death, but you are foreclosing on the future completely. You're giving up, and that's actually worse. Which is quite a pointed comment to make, certainly to your father. But Amram listens to Miriam. He goes back to his wife. They have a child. Moses is saved, taken into the palace, etc., and eventually brings us to our deliverance. This is not to say, of course, that things are nearly that black or white. And it's, of course, understandable that when we are in times of pain and challenge, that there can be that temptation to throw up our hands. And there's also something broadly evocative in terms of the importance of finding and holding on to hope when things are feeling overwhelming, when we might find ourselves in a place of despair. And particularly with the lens that I bring to these podcasts, the role of parenting, the role of having children, the role of what children can represent, and what our obligation, therefore, is as parents. That in moments when things are feeling so overwhelming or painful, that hopefully something that our kids offer us is that hope, is that vision of what the future can be. That it's not something we might always experience, and it doesn't mean it's easy, but it is possible. Later on in the Parsha, when Moses has fled Egypt and he is living his life as a simple shepherd, and of course then he has this vision of the bush that is not consumed, and he hears from God that the name for God in this situation is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, roughly translated as I will be that which I will be. For me, that resonates here in harmony with this other thought, that in this narrative moment, God is represented by seeing that things will unfold in a certain way, which involves then also a certain sense of letting go, of surrender. That God is found by recognizing that there is a larger something, a larger way of being unfolding in the world, and that divinity and holiness can be found in that, and that actually we can connect with that through a certain amount of acceptance and letting go. And that too, I think, is essential in parenting in a variety of ways. I can't control my kids. I can offer input, I can guide, I can scaffold, I can structure, but ultimately they will make their own choices in the world. And this idea of surrender and acceptance is, in my experience, important in life generally and in parenting too. Now, of course, this doesn't absolve me of making wise decisions. This doesn't mean I don't have any agency. This doesn't mean I shouldn't make healthy choices. This doesn't mean I shouldn't be involved in my kid's life. All of those things are true, and it's different for everyone. And I do think that, one, when things are feeling fraught, there's the desire to try to take control, really lean into that. But it's important to have that balance of being present in my life, of claiming agency, while also being some acceptance of things, that there are things that well beyond my control. And that similar dance of being an acceptance of the fact that things can feel fraught and painful, while also working to find hope, that all those things are in dynamic tension with each other. And we see that often through the experience of being parents. I think you don't have to be a parent in order to grapple with this, but certainly the experience of parenting brings a lot of that to the forefront. And I was recently reading an article that there is more and more a movement for people who are saying that they don't want to have kids because they look at the world and they say, well, how can it possibly be the case that I would bring kids into the world the way it is right now? And, there are certainly moments where I get that perspective. But the counterpoint that this article made was that actually, if and when you choose to have kids, when you've brought your kids into the world, there's nothing that'll make you fight harder for what the world can look like than knowing that it's the world that your kids will inherit. Again, I know everybody's going to make different decisions and they need to make the decisions that are right for themselves. But for me, when I'm going through a tough time, when I see that things are feeling overwhelming, that fires are burning, that the world feels like it's swirling, I can look at my kids and I can say, I find hope here, and this is going to make me fight hard for the future that I hope can be in the world. And I can also recognize that at the same time, I recognize that there's a lot beyond my control. And by simultaneously surrendering and letting go to the things that are beyond my control and claiming the places where I can find hope and that I can find some measure of faith and trust in what that hope provides, that just as will unfold in the story, in the narrative that we're going to read over the course of the book of Exodus, that is hopefully what can bring some measure of freedom and some measure of redemption, and bringing us to a place where we can help create a better world.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.